Alrighty, there appears to have been a terrorist attack launched by the Ukrainians on a Russian oblast that I believe is pronounced Bryansk. Now, using the phrase terrorist attack normally is politically controversial. Usually a terrorist attack is only defined as such by one side in any given conflict. The people being attacked call it terrorism. The attackers say, oh, we're not terrorists, we're freedom fighters. You know, the old expression, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, blah, blah, blah. Well, in this case, it does appear to be outwardly and intentionally an act of terrorism. The attack, which according to Putin himself, was a group of men opening fire on a car that had some civilians and including a couple children as passengers. And this car was shot up, and a group called the Russian Volunteer Corps, which is made up of Russian citizens who have defected to Ukraine to fight on their side, they are saying, hey, we did this. This was all us, and we did it to send a message. So if you commit acts of violence against the civilian population in order to make a political point, that is the definition of terrorism. So I don't think that the Russians are at all off base in calling this terrorism. You know, when you're actively in a war, when two countries are at war, you know, both countries like to call the other party terrorists, and most of the time that's not correct because it's normally militaries attacking other militaries, which is not terrorism, that's just plain warfare. But when you have armed goons going and just shooting up civilians in order to encourage other civilians to oppose their government's side in the war, yes, that's terrorism. Now, by itself, is this really a significant event? No, 2 people were killed. Tens of thousands of people have been killed in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine since 2014. Actually, you know, I don't have latest numbers. It's probably getting into the 6-figure range, the deaths, because it was already tens of thousands of people when the war really kicked off last February. And so, are 2 people being killed inside of Russia really that significant in the grand scheme of things? No. But it is a sign of the direction in which the Ukrainians are going and the manner in which they're prosecuting their side of the war. Rather than just trying to combat Russian troops directly and beat them on the battlefield, they're firing over the heads, you know, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively, of the Russian soldiers. They're firing over them and hitting the civilians behind them. And so they've been doing this in the form of drone attacks inside of Russia. They've been talking about, as I've warned in the past, F-16s bombing Crimea or other places inside of Russia. Now we have Ukrainian troops, and they are a part of, you know, the Ukrainian military. They are, you know, welcomed in. They're as official as the Azov Battalion, the Russian Volunteer Corps, doing cross-border raids with the express purpose of killing Russian civilians in order to scare them into, I guess, supporting Ukraine. Honestly, even if they're successful in scaring the people and not just emboldening the people in Russia, making them hate Ukraine even more, even if they were successful in scaring them, I would still be more afraid of turning against my government. I would think that if I'm living on the, you know, Russo-Ukrainian border, on the Russian side, I would still think that I should be more fearful of my own government than the Ukrainian attackers, and so I would still be outwardly loyal, even if I didn't, regardless of the politics, just from a self-preservation standpoint, I would be openly loyal to Russia if I was living on the Russian side, because I'd be much more worried about them, you know, because if these crazy Ukrainian vigilantes cross the border and shoot up a random car, they don't know that car could have been on their side. Those could have been Russians who were sympathetic to Ukraine. being sympathetic to Ukraine inside of Russia gets you nothing. Because as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, you're still a Russian orc. They hate you because of your race, your ethnicity, your language, your history. That is what Ukrainians hate about Russians. Sure, some of these folks in the Russian volunteer corps, they might, the Ukrainian Nazis might pat them on the back and say, you guys are some of the good ones. But they're wearing uniforms with the Ukrainian flag, so I think they're able to get away with passing essentially as Ukrainians. But if you're someone living inside of Russia, a Ukrainian soldier is not going to hesitate if this is their policy. The Ukrainian soldier is not going to ask you, hey, before I kill you, do you support our side or your own government? Because, of course, they would say, well, if we gave them that chance, they would just say, well, of course we're on Ukraine's side because they don't want to die. And so the fact that the Ukrainian government is not condemning this, but rather pretty explicitly endorsing it, and I'll link to an article on antiwar.com by David DeCamp that sums all this up pretty well, and links to other articles. Was it Ukrainian intelligence? Let me look. Yeah, it was a spokesman for Ukraine's military intelligence basically said, hey, there are people from Russia who have defected to our side, and they want to teach their fellow countrymen a lesson. And Russians are just going to have to learn to live with that. So he didn't condemn the act of terrorism committed by the Russian irregular troops who are fighting on the Ukrainian side. And so this doesn't necessarily need to be directed from the top. You don't need Zelensky himself, telling Ukrainian troops, hey, I'm ordering you to go across the border and raid a Russian village and shoot up a car full of civilians every couple of weeks. If they're being told from on high, oh, good job, we like what you're doing here, they're going to do it on their own. They're being given explicit permission as well as encouragement. This is what you support if you're one of these Ukraine flag abbeys. It's one thing to say Russia shouldn't have invaded Ukraine. I don't think they should. I don't think the countries should invade each other, even if there was significant provocation. I'd probably feel different if I was Russian. It's a lot easier for me to sit over here in America and say, yeah, I still think the Ruskies shouldn't have done it. But and this is what I've heard, there were a lot of people probably in Russia who did not support this at first, but there's a lot more now who do, explicitly because of the tactics and the rhetoric employed by the Ukrainian side. And so when they do things like this, they're just emboldening the Russian population and turning them pretty much as, well, I shouldn't say 100%, but pretty darn close to 100% against them. And to me, the way I interpret this, if the Ukrainians are intensifying attacks on the Russian motherland, or whatever they call it, rather than taking back parts of their own land, that to me signals that they're getting a little desperate. Because why would you be wasting resources on it, just taking pot shots on the Russian interior? I feel like they're acting out of impotency rather than strength. If they were strong, what they would be doing is making gains on the battlefield, pushing the Ruskies back inside their own borders, and bombing Russian troops inside of Russia, rather than bombing, Russian civilians inside of Russia. Although they have been bombing military targets too. I should point that out. Ammo depots, train depots, fuel depots, basically anything with the word depot after it has been getting blown up. And there have been indications that they're having CIA help with that, I would imagine. The Ukrainians doing that much sabotage on their own, I think, would be quite difficult for them, considering their reputation for dysfunction and corruption. It was believed before this war that the Russians had very thoroughly infiltrated Ukrainian intelligence, and so I don't think that this sabotage campaign across Russia would have been possible without American assistance. And so sabotage attacks like that are, legitimate military targets, and those do have a reason why they would be effective for helping them make gains on the battlefield. But stuff like this, which the Ukrainian government is endorsing, this is just pure impotency. This is just firing into the crowd for no reason. This is erratic behavior that is not indicative of strength. So with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.